Hey, welcome back to the Embodied Faith podcast. Today we're talking about why does sometimes God feel far away even when we feel like we're doing the right religious things? Why are some of us stuck in our heads when it comes to our spiritual life, and maybe sometimes we feel like others are stuck in their hearts and things like that? Maybe this has to do with differences in our attachment style. That's what we're talking about today. We're talking about being attached to God. As always, I'm Jeff Holsclaw, and this is the Embodied Faith podcast, seeking to integrate neuroscience, spiritual formation, and faith. And we're brought to you by Grassroots Christianity, which is growing faith for everyday people. Today's guest is Krispin Mayfield. He has a background in full-time ministry and is now in private practice as a licensed professional counselor in Oregon. He's trained in attachment-based emotionally focused therapy, and he served over 10 years in trauma recovery programs. And he is a writer, a podcaster, a speaker, and he explores all things relating to faith and psychology. And he wrote a new book called Attached to God, a practical guide to deeper spiritual experience. Krispin, welcome to the show. Thanks for being on today.
Good morning. So glad to be here.
Yeah, well, I'm really excited about this topic. This is something that's it's really central to kind of my own life and exploration and why I started this podcast in the first place. But let's hear just a little bit about your history. You have some history in ministry, but then you shifted and became a counselor. Can you just kind of tell us a little bit about that and kind of how you were led in those things?
Yeah, I started out in Bible college in going towards pastoral ministry. And then after my first year, I had to take that preaching class. And I was like, wait a minute, I got to like stand up in front of people. This is not for me. And so made the shift to psychology, and then with the intention of going on to get my master's in counseling. But I finished that. And then my wife and I went into full-time ministry in Minneapolis with a sort of grassroots organization, engaging in communities there. And that was really formative for me because we were looking at what is the good news for people that are marginalized. And I think that something I haven't even talked about a lot, but that's where some of this book was formed, because what does it mean for the person that has is like experiencing chronic addiction, and what they've been told over and over is like, you're welcome to come here, you're welcome to come into the church, all you got to do is get clean and then you can walk with God. And what's it mean for that person that feels like, I can't get clean, like I don't have, like I just know that I'm going to keep going back to this. And so that really formed a lot of my theology and thinking about God, and reading scripture. How do we see, like, it's obvious to me that God is always caring for those that are marginalized, and thinking about the ways that our theology can further marginalize people and push them out. And I don't think that's unique to people that are living in low-income neighborhood. I think that there are lots of people in the church that are, sitting in the back pews, that are struggling with, depression or anxiety or trauma, and feeling like, all right, like this is promising, hope and peace and compassion, but it just feels like I'm not getting it right. Something here isn't connecting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of people can connect with that idea that like they know that they're supposed to have more hope, peace, love, and faith in their life, and they just can't like make themselves feel that way. And I think that's a product of a lot of our kind of Western left brain discipleship, more information, just sit and pray and read the Bible, and all these sin problems will go away. But I think the reason why, you and myself and a lot of others are diving into like brain science, neuroscience, psychology is to be like, well, maybe there's discipleship tools that we're neglecting. And so that
Mhm.
helped you kind of shift into counseling, led you there
Mhm.
eventually. Is that right? And now
Yeah.
you're okay, go ahead. So how did that shift come about then?
Yeah, after spending 3 years in Minneapolis, I was able to get licensed while I was there, just through some mostly community volunteering. So that was on the back burner. And then when I moved to Portland, I've actually been at an ADHD clinic for the last 6 years. Been in private practice ish settings for 7. And then during that time, I got trained in emotionally focused therapy, which is an attachment based therapy for couples. And that really shaped the way that I do therapy, and really understanding a lot of um, connection and closeness, and when we don't feel close, what's going on, because that's what couples come in for, right? They're like, all right, like we have this relationship, but it's not going the way that we were hoping. And so um, I just took the immense wisdom from that community, and thought like, well, what if we take this to attachment with God? And I should also mention that there is, not only is there a ton of research around attachment in general, there is a ton of attachment, or a ton of research around attachment in God. So this isn't me just saying like, oh, this feels like a metaphor or an analogy. We actually know that our brains respond to relationship with God in a very similar way that they respond to a partner or to our parents, those sorts of things.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's just a mountain of kind of empirical research. In an earlier episode of the podcast, we actually had Todd Hall, and he has done quite a bit of research.
Mhm.
I'm going to have
I'm a
him
big
back on.
fan.
Oh, yeah, me too. I'm going to have him back on just to talk about attachment. We were just talking about spirituality in general, and Richard Beck has done a couple things too, and he was on
Mhm.
last season. Well, okay. Sidebar. You mentioned being in an ADHD clinic, and I have some people who email me kind of about the things we talk about in this podcast, and then ask like, how does this work for like ADHD kind of people and ADHD spirituality? So maybe we should have another episode later about like non-neurotypical like
Mhm.
spiritualities and things like that, which we'll be
I would
covering a
love
little bit
that.
now.
Yeah.
But
I'm learning a lot about like even broader neurodivergence.
right.
In my family, there's are some folks with autism, and so that are autistic is what we would say. So that would be a fun conversation, but we'll come back to that later.
Okay, well, I wrote it down. We'll put a pin on it so we can talk about the neurodivergence, spirituality. But let's get back to attachment then. Yeah, there's this a mountain of kind of literature about these types of things, and especially in the Christian or Judeo-Christian kind of traditions where God is a very personal and involved God.
Mhm.
It does make sense to think of an attachment relationship with God, but could you kind of roll it all the way back to the beginning? What does it mean to have an attachment relationship, this thing called attachment theory or attachment science? Like what
Mhm.
kind of bring it to the basics. What is this?
Yeah, so even before you get to attachment styles, which a lot of people know about, we really want to start with this idea that we have this core drive to connect with another person, which sounds profound, and really fits with Trinitarian theology that says, God created us for relationship. God is in relationship with God's self. Um, but another way of putting it is like, we are herd creatures. We have this instinct to connect, and that's how we feel safe, and that's how we feel healthy. And so, as humans, we need at least one other person that we really connect with and feel bonded to. And so, we have this drive for bonding, for emotional connection, and that drive is maybe not consistently, but can be stronger than our need for food or shelter or self-protection. It's this thing that drives so much of what goes on in our life. And so it started out looking at infants and 1 year olds, and what are the behaviors they do to get connection with their parents. Then you move on and look at partners, like partners. That's the work that I do with couples. Is all right, like you have this deep drive to connect with your partner and stay connected, and so we can understand your behavior through that lens. So I was just telling Jeff before we got on, you might have that person that goes into the other room, right? Conflict comes up, and then you run into the other room, and what you're thinking is, well, it's better for me to run away than it is to stay and for the conflict to get worse. Like, maybe this is going to lose me my relationship. So I'm just going to bail and wait for the smoke to clear, and then maybe things will be okay. And of course, to the other partner, they're like, you're just leaving me. Like, this doesn't show to me that you care about this relationship at all. But some of the work we do is starting to understand that this drive for connection just determines so much of our behavior and relationship. So then I'm, going through my training and looking at the ways that people try to get this connection. And then I'm going to church and I'm sitting there and thinking, oh, these are all, we call them proximity seeking behaviors. These are all ways that we're trying to get connection with God. And it looks different for different people. For some people, it's like, I'm doing the worshiping thing, or, making sure I have quiet time every day. For some people, it's like, I try to not think about God because I feel like I'm such a disappointment. And so at least if I can just sort of like have God in the background of my mind, that's less painful than the actual feeling like there's something wrong with the relationship. But you can look at all these different behaviors. And what really struck me, if I could just jump ahead a little bit,
Yeah, do it.
is it really why I wanted to write the book is because in so much attachment research, the researchers have said, what's amazing about religion, so they're coming from a not necessarily like from a spiritual place, but just from a, scientific, psychological place. And they say, well, religion is great because God will always be that person that you can always connect with. One aspect of attachment is we need a refuge in our life, that person to go to when things are rough. And so they're saying, God is the ultimate attachment figure. You can just always go to God and God's going to be there. And I'm reading this and I'm like, but what if you grew up in a tradition where it's like, yeah, you can get close to God, but you need to jump through all these hoops and you need to make sure to show up to church on every Sunday, and you need to make sure all your sin is confessed, or, X, Y, and Z. And so my kind of endeavor was like, so what happens if you have an insecure relationship with God? Where do we go from there?
Yeah. Yeah, that was great. Well, let's go into those different styles then, because uh, like what I've found is that we'll just say secure attachment. So someone who is securely attached, they have kind of a healthy or integrated kind of desire to connect with people, and they always had that connection affirmed. They were provided
Mhm,
for when when they sought proximity. They found it,
mhm,
right? So then,
mhm,
like these religious traditions, kind of the exhortations, to read, study scripture, pray, like those kind of do work for people who are securely attached because they kind of have
mhm,
a hopeful worldview. They
mhm,
kind of have a sense of their own agency. They believe other people are, somewhat good and available, right? And so that kind of
mhm,
works, right? So, and then pastors,
mhm,
hopefully, they're not total basket case or whatever, right? So we'll just say on the whole, like moderately healthy, integrated, secure people, like kind of find life in those practices. But what you're saying, and I
mhm,
think what a lot of pastors and ministers and counselors and people in the back of the pew, they're like, I'm not finding life in any of that stuff. Like I feel totally stuck. So instead
mhm,
of doubling down and making people feel more guilty or ashamed for not doing it right, I think these attachment styles, being aware of different attachment styles, maybe can create a little more self compassion. So why don't
mhm,
we why don't we look at the because there's three kind of insecure attachment styles, and they're kind of two of them are kind of on par and kind of mirrors of each other or opposites, and then one is
mhm,
a lot more kind of chronic or crisis or disorganized or whatever. So why don't we
mhm.
do the first two, the what you call the anxious, and then the other one is called the shutdown, right?
Yeah.
Why don't you just talk about the anxious one?
Yeah, and I guess just real quick before we go there, there are researchers will say there's four attachment styles, and so there's one secure, and then there's three insecure, and you fall into one of those four. What I find as humans is that no matter how much we live in security, we will dip into one of these insecure styles. So that's why I structured the book the way I did. I didn't ask, are you secure or insecure? My question is, like, when you feel insecure, when you go to that insecure place, what are the strategies you use? So
Mhm.
that first one is, yeah.
Well, yeah, so it's more like a continuum for sure.
Uh-huh.
And then it's very context specific, and so you could act, like a very well put together person at your job, but then the
Mhm.
moment you get into a romantic relationship, your attachment needs spikes, that
Mhm.
longing or fear of connection spikes, and then all of a sudden this other behavior comes out, and you're like, and everyone's like, "You kinda
Right.
seem like a different person." You're like, "I know, I fell
Uh-huh.
in love and I turned into a monster." Right,
Right.
okay, so it's a
I love it.
continuum.
Yeah.
It's a
Mhm.
continuum, and it depends on context, so, okay. So jump
Yeah,
in it.
definitely. Yeah, and so that first one is anxious attachment, and in human relationships, this is that person that's really clingy. I sent you a text 2 minutes ago, you haven't responded back, what's wrong? And what that looks like from the outside is like, "Oh my gosh, this person is so needy. What's wrong with them?" From the inside, what it feels like is the relationship is up to me. That connection is up to me. And so I need to monitor it all the time. I need to make sure it's okay. If there's like a little hint of like maybe something's wrong, I need to go investigate that, because I can't trust that that person is going to stick around for me. I can't trust back after 2 minutes that that love is still there, that connection is still there, because I learned early on that it's up to me to keep the people that I love close. And so you can imagine then what that looks like with in doing research for the book, I found all these examples of prominent church teachings that sort of point us in that direction, that say, Charles Spurgeon talking about how the Christian life is like climbing up a hill of ice, and you have to like if you stop for a moment, you're going to slide backwards, which really reinforces that anxious attachment style. It says, yeah, you're right, you do need to be worried all the time. One of the clinical terms for it is preoccupied, and I think it's a really helpful term, because what that means is you're so preoccupied with that connection, you can't focus on much else, right? You're sitting there and you're trying to focus on your work, but the fact that the person you care about, the person you love, hasn't texted back, makes it hard to focus on anything else until I know that connection's there.
Right, and it's also kind of a preoccupation with the past a little bit, as the past is always present, and sometimes
Hmm.
it's difficult to separate this relationship from past relationships, and this kind
Hmm.
of relationship bump from other past relationships, and then it just all becomes like a giant kind of
Right.
avalanche where everything just
Hmm.
kind of floods in. What would
Right.
be so you mentioned like clingy, controlling, and eating. What are some other ways that you mentioned a couple of things about Spurgeon and things like that. What do you think, or do you notice as like anxious spiritual behavior? Um,
Yeah. So,
Understanding that's very context specific. So like,
right. Yeah.
just
Totally. And a lot of it is about the motivation behind it, right? So, it's about like, am I doing this thing because I'm worried that if I don't do it, I'm going to lose connection with God, or God's gonna become distant in some way.
mhm,
And so, yeah, sometimes that rigidity around like I have to do my spiritual practices, or else I'm going to lose connection.
mhm.
um the exa the example that comes to mind for me often is, I grew up evangelical kid in the '80s and '90s. McGee and Me was a Focus on the Family video.
Oh, come
Um,
on. I
uh,
gotcha. Yeah.
right.
Love it.
And, in the first episode, the main character, he's 11, he lies about his neighbor. Dad comes in to have a little talk with him and says, "Lying's bad because it hurts other people." But it's really bad because it's a sin, and sin can cut off your relationship with God. And that's a whole theological conversation. Um, but if we're looking at this message for me as like a 10-year-old, what I heard is like, you got to be perfect. You can't lie. You can't do any of these things, or else you're going to lose your relationship with God. And
Mhm.
then if we put that in context of, you're not saved by works, you're saved by your relationship with Jesus. But
Mhm.
that relationship depends on your works, right? It just doesn't work very well. But I think that's a really good example, because this is coming from Focus on the Family, who would, at that time be sort of bastions of evangelical theology that says it's really about God's grace. And yet, even to kids, there's this little message saying, you got to be careful, you got to watch out, you got, that sort of thing. And probably a lot
Mhm.
of people listening are like, oh yeah, I remember, getting those messages, whether it was implicit or explicit.
Right, that it's your job to, um, manage your relationship with God, and the
Mhm.
idea that God is seeking you or loves you or is coming after you or pursuing you or things like that, is totally minimized. So what is
Mhm.
the answer then? So if anxious spirituality is feeling like the relationship is all about me, you talk about, well, they need to move into this place of rest. What is that?
Mm.
What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so that's where some of the spiritual practices that we have um, that we've actually thrown out of the evangelical church for in some ways some good reason. I understand, like, for a lot of people it felt like these are like dead old practices that aren't life-giving. But it's been really neat to rediscover some of these things that have been around for a long time. Contemplative prayer is a really good example of that, where for me growing up, my quiet time was like, I got to make sure I learn something. I got to make sure that I know the thing that I'm supposed to do this week. Very goal oriented. And contemplative prayer is can be a lot of different practices. That's a pretty general term, but finding ways of spirituality where it's like I'm resting with God. This isn't about me doing something for God, or trying to get to a certain goal in this relationship. This is just me being able to relax and rest. And it's interesting. Um, there is even some research in attachment science and God around how there are different sort of phases of the attachment relationship, and we need to know that we are unconditionally loved and rooted in that belonging before we can go out and do things. And that makes so much sense. And if you've read Henry Nouwen, you can see those themes all over his work. But it's not either or, but it's like we really need this sense of rest, and to know from a secure place that what I do isn't me performing for God, because those other things are important. But if it gets confused with, my belonging with God is dependent on that, then there's going to be anxiety. So how do we find ways to have a more restful spirituality, which I think is really important, because if you think about Israel being brought out of Egypt and God instituting this new nation, the most particular thing about that new nation was that there was a specific day for rest. So I
Mhm.
think that is like very important to God. And so if we have a spirituality that doesn't have rest as part of it, then we need to be asking some questions.
Yeah, for sure. And the tricky thing though, and this is why we have to do it in communities, because for an anxious person, recommending silence and solitude to them is like the things they're weakest at and that they hate the most. I don't want to be by myself. I already
Uh-huh.
have I don't want to be alone with my thoughts.
Uh-huh.
And it's just
Right.
like so that was one kind of like one side.
Hmm.
The shutdown is a little bit kind of the opposite. So what are some of the characteristics
Hmm.
of what you call a shutdown
Yeah, so
style?
this is someone that um generally looks really independent. They're like, I don't need other people, I don't have needs, I don't have emotions. I think the clearest picture of this is demographically is white men, from the boomer generation, um, because they were taught, like, it's just so clear to me, working with people from that generation, so clear to me that they were taught, be a man, handle it on your own, be independent. that was kind of the idea of what it meant to be a male person.
Mhm.
And so when you think about that person that's like, yeah, I would rather just like work in the garage all day than, hang out with other people.
Mhm.
And you're starting to think like, all right, so how is that an attachment strategy? What does that have to do with connection? But it makes a lot of sense that if you grew up, say you grew up in a family where if you cried or if you expressed neediness or if you're worried, your parent was like, stop doing that, and shamed you for it. Stop crying, I'll give you something to cry about. It makes sense then that you learn, if I'm going to keep my parent close and I'm going to keep connection with them and not feel rejected by them, I have to pretend like I'm okay and I have to stuff these emotions down. And so it makes sense then, this is actually this person's way of keeping connection. And actually in the research, they found that um, when they would look at 1-year-olds with this attachment style, because 1-year-olds will show up with this attachment style. The 1-year-old would kind of do this little circle around mom. They wouldn't get close, but they wouldn't get far. And they had kind of figured out what's the perfect distance. I don't want to get too close because mom's going to be like, what are you doing? Go play. Right. But they don't want to go too far. They want to figure out like what is that balance where I can get close but not too close. And so then you bring that into the church and it's like, yeah, I can't share my emotions with God. And then we're given messages about that. We're told, if you're worried, if you're sad, that means you don't have enough faith. um you know uh, it means that there's something wrong with your faith. I remember sitting in a church service one time where someone said, yeah, you can feel grief, but if your grief causes you to ask if God is not good, then you have to stop. Actually, he said you have to crucify that emotion on the cross. I'm not sure what that means. But in the church we do worry, like, well, what if these emotions, what if they lead us away from God? Which I think if you read Psalms or prophets, you're like, oh, here are all these people that are like crying out to God and saying like, why have you abandoned us? Are you good? um but we get into this, especially in Western Christianity, this idea of emotions are the opposite of the truth. And if I'm
Mhm.
going to stay close to God and I'm going to believe the true thing, then I need to stuff down my emotions or I need to ignore my emotions. And, you might even be listening to this and you're like, yeah, that sounds like a really good strategy. Why is this wrong? And it doesn't work, because what we find is that true connection, this attachment, is really born out of emotional connection. And it doesn't mean that you use a lot of like flowery words, but it's having that person in your life, whether it's your partner or God, where it's like, today was a hard day, right? Being able to share that with someone who's going to be responsive, that creates a connection there, that creates a safety. And that's what relationships are about. And so if you're going through your whole life being like, I'm fine, I'm an island, the other people in your life are going to be like, okay, well, that works for you, but I don't feel very close or connected to you.
Mhm.
So,
Mm.
coming from a couples therapist.
Yeah, yeah, no, for sure. And I think just the last couple episodes on the podcast were all about needing to be emotionally healthy and things like that. So, and I think
Mhm.
especially Western, especially white kind of Christian Western, the milieu is very kind of down on emotions. So, you kind of hinted at it a little bit, but what would it mean to shift from being shut down to being engaged? You kind of want them to like engage more. What does that mean practically?
Yeah. So, I mean, what's great is that this Western white logic, rational, systemic approach to spirituality is not actually how the Bible is written. And so, what's great is if you want to start dipping your toes in emotion and what that looks like. One thing is to engage in the narratives of scripture, maybe spend a little time away from Paul and and read some stories, because those are personal experiences, the experiences of people. I think just thinking about the way that Jesus taught, right? Jesus didn't say, all right, so here's my doctrine on this, here's my doctrine on this. Jesus comes and teaches and tells us stories. So, what does it feel like to be a worker that showed up last and get paid the same, right?
Mhm.
Like, I think some of what Jesus is doing there is helping people emotionally experience. And actually, when it comes to attachment and the way our brains work, that's how we heal attachment. If we want more security, we need things like metaphors, we need stories, we need body language, all the kind of non like verbal things that bring that healing. So that's a place to start. I have some other thoughts in my book, but that's part of it. So
Oh, that's really great. I think, um, for shutdown people, um, their minds actually don't prioritize emotional language and nonverbal communication, and so
hmm
part of that being engaged is to become engaged with their own bodies and their own
hmm
emotions, and then like what you said is the stories. It's striking that we believe in a personal God
hmm
who values the whole person, and that revelation, as we call it in scripture, is primarily story. Right. But
hmm
most shutdown people are like Paul's letters, like, we got to get to the information. We
right.
need to, you know, s- cut away all the stories and just get at the ideas. And that's actually counterproductive to our full integrated humanity.
hmm
Um, yeah. And he has some other spiritual practices, but I want to get to the last one, which is kind of a shame filled attachment style, which is kind of, it's well, as far as the research goes, it's usually a smaller portion of
hmm
the anxious or the shutdown styles are predominant as far as insecure. So the shame one is sometimes called disorganized or things like that, or fear-based attachment style.
Fearful, yeah.
Fearful.
Yeah. Yeah, and what we see in this fearful attachment style is I am afraid to be on my own. So it's different than the shut down person that's more like, I'm fine on my own, don't worry about me. This is like I actually feel scared and feel like I'm alone in the world and I want connection. But then there's this other part of me that knows if I get close to you, I'm going to get shamed, I'm going to get rejected, or I'm going to get hurt. And this comes up most often with kids that have experienced abuse because from their parents. So my parent is supposed to be my safe person. I have this drive for connection with them. And then at the same time, my protective instincts are saying, don't get near this person, they're going to hurt you. And that is a heartbreaking place for kids to be in, obviously. And as I was thinking through the research, even though this attachment style is not that prevalent, although, again, we're looking at categories, I think there are a lot of people that maybe are in that anxious or shut down, but they'll recognize this part as well.
Mhm.
And what I found is that this resonates with a lot of us. Well, I'll say it resonates with me, where it's like, I want to be close to God. I've been told that God is compassionate and kind, and also I don't want to go to hell. I want this connection with God, and yet I'm worried with this holy God, if I get close, God is going to be disgusted with me. God's going to be disappointed in me. And that's really painful because I care about this relationship. So then I'm
Mhm.
stuck in this place where it's like I can either be alone and lonely, or I can be close and feel judged and feel bad about myself. And so this was actually kind of the most powerful thing for me in writing. And for those that are psychologically minded, make sure to check out the chapter. There's not even time here to talk about um, the research around kids that have been neglected and some of their experience and how that really shows up in similar metaphors and images to some of the stuff that we teach in church to kids. So that's a whole other that's it's a bigger concept, but there is this piece of like, I want to be close to God, but God's going to be disappointed in me. I can't be holy enough to get close to a holy God. So maybe my best strategy, my best attachment strategy is to just tell God, yeah, I know I'm horrible. I know I'm useless. I know I'm worthless. Maybe now you'll let me in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's where I feel like the attachment styles and this perspective kind of helps us have a more nuanced approach to discipleship and spirituality, a
Mhm.
more nuanced, hopefully, a more nuanced or at least multiple ways of explaining the gospel. And so if
Mhm.
you are talking to a relatively shut down person, some of their characteristics of being independent and self-sufficient, actually you do need to kind of break that down and be like, actually you're not self-sufficient, and so you
Mhm.
kind of have to tell them some of the no you aren't, so that they can engage in the relationships again. But that
Mhm.
message is kind of, doesn't do good work for anxious people, and certainly doesn't
Mhm.
do good work for shame-filled people, right? And so we need
Right.
more strategies, whereas for the shutdown person, just to be like, God loves you and he embraces you. It's just like, they're like, who, whatever, like that
Yeah.
kind of bounces off them. But that is what an anxious person needs to know. It's like, God loves you and it
Mhm.
isn't going anywhere. And they're like, oh, I need to
Mhm.
rest in that. And the shutdown person's like,
Uh-huh.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Right. And so it kind of
Yeah.
helps. I think, or I hope that it helps us kind of broaden the way we communicate the gospel. And, you know, it helps
Mhm.
us, all of us, whether it's our children, our
Mhm.
partners or other people we're with, just to kind of,
Yeah.
let people be where they are rather than
Mhm.
kind of demand that they fit in
Yeah.
this one mold. And then this
Mhm.
is always the first step in your spiritual
Right.
life. This is always the second step. And this is over.
Mhm.
So that's
Yeah,
kind of
right.
how
I
I
mean,
found it.
I think I've sat in enough church services, um, and I'm not trying to like pick on pastors. I'm just saying why understanding this is so important, like what you're saying, Jeff, right? I've sat in services where pastors are like, "You're not as good as you think you are," and like maybe the pastor needs to hear that. But like I can guarantee that that person that like barely made it to church this morning, that's in the throes of depression, that hates themselves, does not need to be told you're so much worse than you think you are.
Mhm.
Like they need to be told you might think that you are worthless, you might feel like you are unlovable, but actually God created you, God delights in you, God sees something in you that you can't see in yourself.
Mm. Yeah, amen. Which is also in the Bible, right? It's not like
Right.
it's not like we're
Yeah.
just making up other stuff and like wishing
No.
the Bible said something different, right?
Right.
Like the
Yeah.
Christian tradition is wide enough and big enough to actually, I think,
Mhm.
has always developed resources and kind of perspectives around all this. Well, thanks so much for jumping on. The book again is Attached to God by Krispin Mayfield, published by Zondervan. You can find it everywhere. It just released a couple
Mhm.
weeks ago, and it's very accessible, very readable. So thanks for
Yeah, I
jumping
I
on.
definitely dipped into the, like, more nerdy side of things,
Oh yeah,
that
yeah, yeah. No, I
that
love it.
my publishers were like, "Can we say this a different" my editor was like, "How do we say this in a way that everyone's gonna understand?" So,
Good,
which is
good.
my hope with the book, that it's
Yeah.
gonna be, if you like this stuff, you're like, "Oh, yeah, I'm tracking." If you're like, "I have no idea what this is about," don't worry, it's explained, so.
Yeah, and he uses lots of stories from his own life as well as people he's
Mhm.
worked with and things like that. Well, thanks again. Where can people find you online and all the socials and whatnot?
Yeah, yeah, I'm on Twitter and Instagram, Crispin Mayfield. If you know how to spell my name, you can find me. There aren't a lot of us out there. And then my website, crispinmayfield.com. Yeah. I'm also used to saying attachedtogod.com, making sure, which is where you can find my book. So
Excellent.
there, yeah, pretty easy to find me on the internet.
It's
Thank you
very,
so much.
very Googleable. My name's very Googleable either. There's no
Mhm.
other Jeffs with a G, Holsclaw, so it's pretty easy.
Yeah.
Well, good. Well, thanks so much. As always, you can find this podcast on iTunes. You can listen to us on Spotify. Also, please rate and review. If you'd rather watch this is on YouTube under Jeffrey Holsclaw. That's my channel. So check those things out. And thanks again. We'll talk sometime soon, maybe about the neurodivergent spiritual
Mhm.
formation.
That'd be lovely. Thanks, Jeff.
Excellent. Yeah. See you.